Hi everyone, this is Anders Ibsen from Windermere Professional Partners, managing broker of Anders Ibsen Homes. Now, as of now, November 2023, we just had an election. And one of the major issues on the ballot that you might have seen if you live in Tacoma is the question of changes to landlord-tenant rules. And as of now, it looks like measure number 1 seems to be passing. Understandably, a lot of Tacoma homeowners and landlords have questions, which is what I'd like to address. But before we go into that, let me first start by telling you what this video is not. This is not political commentary on whether or not Measure 1 was good or bad, and it is certainly not legal advice. I'm not an attorney, I'm not even a property manager. What I am is a real estate agent. I am a small landlord. I own 2 rentals in the area, and I'm also a former city councilman who happened to vote on landlord-tenant issues a number of years ago. So I see this issue from a variety of different perspectives. What my goal is with this video is to just give objective, high-level information about what this measure changes so that you can be fully prepared and you can know what you have to do to comply with it. So with all that said, let's get started. Mostly what this measure focuses on is changes to evictions and rent increases and when they can or cannot happen. For example, if at any time your renter identifies defective conditions in your property, like health and safety issues or building code violations, like maybe the heating system isn't working or there are issues with plumbing or electrical, or even smaller things like if an appliance doesn't work, potentially, then if you try to raise the rent or start an eviction process, that could potentially be challenged by the renter in writing. Fees are also capped. For instance, for any kind of move-in related costs, those fees can now no longer be more than the equivalent of 1 month's rent. And now, if your renter is late on rent, the most in late fees a renter can be charged is just $10 per month. The written notice period has also been increased for raising rent. Now, under the new rules, you have to give at least a 6-month written notice anytime you want to raise the rent on a month-to-month tenant. And during that same period, you also have to give a second written notice prior to the rent increase going into effect. Otherwise, your rent increase could be challenged. Finally, relating to rent increases, if you increase the rent past a certain threshold, you may owe your renter relocation assistance if your renter chooses to move prior to the new rent increase going into effect. So let's say hypothetically you're charging below market $1,000 a month for one of your units, and you want to increase the rent to $1,050 per month. That's a 5% increase. If at any point after your renter receives notification, your renter chooses to move instead of being charged the higher rent, then you owe the renter a multiplier of the monthly rent, which could be as little as 2 times the monthly rent, which in that case would be $2,000. Or if your increase goes as high as a 10% increase, so let's say you want to increase the rent from $1,000 a month to $1,100 per month, then you would be charged 3 times the monthly rent. So that means you would owe your renter $3,000 to help them move. So what this means as an implication to any landlord watching is that this is something you have to start budgeting for. So besides reserves for repairs or maintenance or vacancies, it's important to probably start saving some money away for relocation assistance. So that covers most of the changes to rent increases. Now let's talk evictions. One of the biggest changes coming from this measure is a ban on what are called cold weather evictions for most kinds of evictions. So there are some evictions that can still take place during the November through April period, like criminal activity or the owner moving into one of the units. But for most kinds of evictions, like non-payment of rent or lease violations, like maybe your tenant smokes inside the unit when your rules say they can't, those kind of evictions can now no longer take place within the November through April period because those are considered cold weather months. Furthermore, if any occupant of the unit is either a student, the parent guardian of a student, or an educator, then those kinds of occupants of your unit can no longer be evicted throughout the school year. So effectively, for most kinds of evictions that aren't related to criminal activity or owner occupancy, so think non-payment of rent, lease violations, sale of a single family property, effectively most of those evictions can now only take place during the spring or the summer. So that's just something to think of in terms of how you plan your rental. Another subtle but very important change through this measure is the definition of what eviction actually means. Prior to the measure passing, you could choose not to renew a regular term lease, like a 1-year lease, for any lawful reason. You just have to give a 60-day written notice. Now, eviction also refers to the non-renewal of a lease. And this is not addressed by the measure. It's an area of ambiguity. But my interpretation is that if you had a lease that expired, for example, in December, a cold weather month, or maybe in the middle of the school year and you happen to have, say, a teacher living in the unit, that might be cause for not being able to not renew the lease, and perhaps it might default to a month-to-month tenancy. This isn't really clearly articulated. This is probably something that's going to be fleshed out or better understood as the law becomes applied, but that is just something to keep in mind as you plan your business. So it's pretty clear, even though we're just scratching the surface, that this is a pretty complex law. The other thing to understand is that it's a pretty strict law as well. There is very little room for error. At the barest minimum, if you do something wrong, like you don't properly go through the eviction process or you don't properly give notice of rent increases, then at the most lenient end of the curve, you're going to have your action nullified. If your renter objects and takes you to court, or if a third party objects on behalf of the renter and takes you to court, then that could potentially cancel your attempt to raise the rent or evict a tenant. But there are also some pretty significant financial penalties to be aware of as well if you do anything wrong. At the lowest end, it's at least a $500 fine, and at the highest end, it's a multiplier of the monthly rent, which can go as high as 5 times what you're charging. So for instance, if you have a single family home that you're renting out for, say, $2,000 a month, and if you really screw something up with trying to have an eviction or trying to raise the rent, you could potentially be on the hook for a $10,000 fine. That's not something you want to take lightly. So if there's one takeaway that you should have from understanding this rule, it's this. There is no excuse for not being a landlord-tenant expert. It's really important to get a clear understanding of the law, or if you don't have the capacity for that, hire someone who does. A good property manager, and probably a good landlord-tenant attorney as well, so you can fully understand what this new law is going to mean for you and how you can successfully comply with it. And if you need a referral for any of those people, like a good property manager, a good attorney, I'm more than happy to do that for you. And frankly, after having listened to this overview, if you've come to the conclusion that, you know what, maybe landlording isn't for me after all, and you're just interested in hearing what options you might have for your property, or even just what it's worth, I'm more than happy to have that conversation with you too. Once again, thank you so much for watching. This is Ibsen with Windermere Professional Partners. Keep the questions coming. Have a great day.